Hey, what's up, guys? Today I'll show you a horror TV series named The Haunting of Hill House Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with the narration of a young man. The eerie Hill House, a century-old mansion engulfed in darkness, takes center stage. A couple with their 5 kids have become the new inhabitants of Hill House. One night, the eldest sibling, Stephen, hears his little sister Nell crying. Curious and concerned, he leaves his bed to investigate. Walking down the corridor, he reaches the room of Nell. Nell wakes up from her dream in a startle. Upon inquiry, it's revealed that she saw a lady with a crooked neck passing by. Hearing the commotion, their father rushes to Nell's room, questioning what had happened. Pointing towards the side of her bed, Nell insists that Crook Lady was there. The father reassures her that everything she saw was merely a figment of her imagination and that there are no ghosts in the world. As he comforts her, he also explains that dreams can often seem real. When asked when they would move out, the father tells her they'll leave once they've finished selling the house. In the hallway, the father hears another daughter sleep-talking about a red house dancing. He peeks into her room but doesn't pay much mind. After he leaves, Nell finds the door that was closed earlier, inexplicably open. She calls out to her sleeping brother next to her, but there's no response. Then, shockingly, Crook Lady appears behind Nell. Time flashes back to the present. By now, Stephen, who has grown up and become a famous horror novelist, is conducting an interview with a lady fan. He uses this chance to gather information for his upcoming work. As he listens to the lady fan recount her horrifying experiences, he becomes engrossed. She tells him about her husband, who died in a car accident on a rainy night. Every time she falls asleep, she can feel the chilling raindrops falling on her face. She looks up to see her husband, his face a ghastly purple, hanging upside down from the ceiling in a bizarre pose. Water droplets trickle down his hair. He's making a blaring noise from his mouth. Intrigued by the lady fan's experience, Stephen is even considering visiting the haunted house himself. Just then, he receives a call from his sister Nell, but chooses not to answer it. The scene shifts back to the past. Nell is still shaken by the ghostly figure she encountered in her room. She's too scared to sleep there, so she asks her mother to accompany her on the couch. After her mother tucks her to sleep, she leaves. In the middle of the night, Nell wakes up in terror. As soon as she opens her eyes, she sees Crook Lady hovering in midair, staring at her. The sight gives her quite a scare. Many years later, as an adult, Nell suddenly remembers this incident and grows increasingly uneasy. She attempts to call her sister Shirley, but fails to get through. The camera shifts again, landing on Shirley, who now owns a funeral home. She's currently discussing with a couple whether they should include a viewing ceremony at their grandmother's funeral. After work, Shirley listens to the voicemail left by Nell, who seems to be worried about her brother. She tries to return Nell's call, but there's no answer. The scene shifts back to their childhood. The butler of the Hill House presents Shirley with a so-called master key. However, this master key cannot unlock the red door on the top floor's partition. Nell claims she saw moving shadows through the keyhole of this door. Naturally, Shirley doesn't believe her. However, once they turn to leave, indeed a shadow moves within the keyhole. The scene transitions to Shirley and her younger sister Theo drinking beer together. Through their conversation, we learn that there's a rift between Nell and Theo, stemming from an incident in Los Angeles. Theo even urges Shirley to distance herself from Nell. At the same time, their father, lying in bed, feels a woman's hand stroking his back. Turning around in fright, he sees a phantom. Luckily, it's just a dream. Still shaken, he receives a phone call from Nell, who asks him if he remembers Crook Lady from their childhood. She claims that this woman is back. When the father asks where she is, she replies that she is home, but in reality, she is sitting in her car, parked at the entrance to Hill House. The once abandoned house is now brightly lit. Hearing this, the father calls Stephen, instructing him to keep an eye on Nell before he swiftly heads towards her house. Back to their childhood, the father got up at night and woke up Stephen, stating that they needed to leave. It was a mystery how the locked door to Stephen's room had its knob turned by itself. The father then warned Stephen that they would have to escape, and no matter what they heard, they mustn't open their eyes. The father got Stephen and the rest of the children into the car. The children kept asking where their mother was, but their father remained silent. From the back window of that gloomy house, Stephen saw a woman's silhouette. Only later did the children learn that their mother had ended her life in that house. Fast forward to the present, Stephen is sleeping in the haunted house of the lady fan, while Nell is dancing gracefully at Hill House. Everyone falls asleep, and at exactly 3:03 a.m., all the siblings would wake up at the same time. Upon awakening, Stephen notices water droplets on his face and hears a horn from outside. This situation was exactly as the lady fan had described. After an investigation, Stephen realizes that the water leak was due to a deteriorating ceiling, and the horn was due to stolen parking signs on the street. The lady fan seeing her husband hanging was simply a figment of her imagination from missing him too much. Rewinding to the past, the father became a suspect in the death of his wife, but he was unafraid of the police's accusation. The father escaping with his 5 children caused a great stir in the community after being reported by the media. The lawyer hoped to conduct an interview with the media at the Hill House, but the father declined. He didn't want anyone else to get close to that house. Only the father knew what happened that night. One day, Stephen visited the Butler couple, inquiring about some matters related to the Hill House. After that, he went to the book house and found his youngest brother, Luke. Luke was sketching a girl he had encountered in the forest, a girl named Abigail dressed in blue. Luke had created several pieces of art centered around this girl. Suddenly, Stephen noticed a sketch on the floor. It was a woman with a wide open mouth. He asked his brother where he got the inspiration for these drawings. Luke simply shrugged, staring blankly at Stephen. Now, we return to the present timeline. When Stephen returned home, he encountered Luke in the stairwell. Despite it being summer, Luke was wearing a heavy coat. He had a camera in one hand and an iPad in the other. It was clear that Luke's addiction had resurfaced. Luke exchanged his gadgets for the money in Stephen's hand. Back at home, Stephen found the door lock smashed by Luke. Upon turning on the lights, he saw Nell standing in the room. He chastised her for doing nothing while Luke stole things, and asked her what was the emergency since she had called all the family members to come to the Hill House. At that moment, he received a call from their father. He was told that Nell had ended her own life at Hill House. She was actually dead. Slowly, Stephen turned around to see the figure of Nell, her face grotesquely twisted, mouth open to welcome any smelly turds. Shocked, he fell to the ground, gasping for breath. He was confused, wondering why Nell suddenly terminated herself at this house. What was she trying to say when she called the rest of their siblings earlier? The mystery deepens, and the truth remains elusive. Meanwhile, Shirley was sound asleep at night. As usual, she woke up startled at 3:03 a.m., muttering, "Nell is in the red room." The next day, as part of her job, she went to the house of the child who has the third eye to inquire about the funeral of his grandmother. The boy said he already knew his grandmother had passed away, but she still visited him every night. The grandmother he saw last night was vastly different from before. Her fingers turned purple, she had no teeth, and her hair was gone. The boy was terrified and didn't want to see his grandmother in this state. Shirley told the boy that she knew certain ways to erase these horrifying images and restore his grandmother's kind countenance. She explained that his grandmother's body had to be bathed to ensure it became soft, and then soaked in a special solution to fix its form. After that, they would dress her in new clothes and apply makeup, and his grandmother would instantly look as she did before. Suddenly, Shirley remembered her childhood when their mother designed a house and called it Eternal House. Their mother decided that after selling Hill House, she and their father would build the Eternal House together. Just then, Nell came to ask Shirley to play with her. Their mother told the 2 children that they could play outside until dinner time, but they must come back as soon as she flicked the corridor light twice. At this moment, Luke was playing with his dolls on the grass. When he lifted his head, he noticed a distant little girl in a blue dress, standing among the trees, looking back at him from afar. Shirley was snapping photos all around. She found a graveyard within the nearby woods and also a small cabin. Inside, she found a litter of kittens. As she raised her camera to capture the kittens, she suddenly noticed a horrifying face lurking in the shadows. She screamed on the spot. Upon hearing the commotion, the father and the butler arrived to find that the horrifying face was merely a mask surrounded by a wasp's nest. Shirley worried that the dogs in the mountain might kill the motherless kittens, but the butler assured her that there were no dogs on the estate. However, every child in the house could hear the barking of dogs at night. Fast forward to the present. The funeral home Shirley runs with her husband was barely making ends meet, which led to disagreements between them. At that moment, a client brought in a box containing her mother's jewelry and photographs. After her husband escorted the departing client, Shirley noticed a man sitting on the couch, waving to her. When she looked up again, the man had vanished. One day, she found her husband's private account on her mobile phone, which struck her as peculiar. That night, she shared this with Theo, who advised her to confront him about it instead of letting her imagination distort the truth. After everyone had fallen asleep, Theo was awakened by a sudden knock on the wall. She thought it was Shirley intentionally knocking and, in anger, stormed into her room to confront her. Shirley looked perplexed. Theo thought she was lying. As the two stared each other down, a sudden bout of dog barking shattered the quiet of the late night, and the wall before them started to make a tremendous noise. The children's screams brought their father, who claimed he hadn't heard any sound and tried to calm them, saying it was just the sound of the hot water pipes. Suddenly, their father's face twisted grotesquely, and he let out a chilling scream. Shirley woke up with a start when Stephen called to tell her about Nell's death, who killed herself. Shirley was heartbroken and struggled to accept this fact, going outside to grieve alone. The time shifts back to their childhood at Hill House. The children had made a nest for the kittens out of a cardboard box, and they took turns feeding them milk. But to their surprise, one of the kittens died the next day. Their mother asked Shirley to bury it. Taking the cardboard box containing the body, Shirley noticed that the kitten's throat had moved. She was startled to discover a terrifying bug. The scene shifts to his grandmother's funeral, where the boy finally overcame his fear and gazed at his grandmother's remains. This reminded Shirley of the time when she was a child at her mother's funeral, similarly terrified. No matter how their father coaxed her, she dared not look ahead. Ultimately, she had to hold back her fear under the undertaker's guidance and look at her mother's body, which was not as terrifying as she had imagined, but as gentle as she remembered. This time, Shirley decided to personally arrange her sister Nell's funeral, but she didn't want Luke to attend. Theo thought it was unfair that Luke wasn't even allowed to attend his sister's funeral. When Shirley received Nell's remains and looked at her deceased face, she thought of the kittens they had raised when they were young. When only one kitten was left from the litter, Shirley picked it up and found out that it had no pupils. Their mother quietly buried the kitten, but she told Shirley that they had given the kitten to someone else to care for. Shirley was very angry because she felt that her mother had given away her kitten without her consent. This resulted in a big argument between mother and daughter, which triggered the mother's migraine. Back to the present, Shirley is tidying up the dead Nell. Her two children sneak into the place. Shirley steps outside to chat with them. The kids are curious about their deceased aunt. To keep them occupied, Shirley suggests they pick out their favorite photo from their aunt's album to use at the funeral. While Shirley is applying makeup to Nell, she recalls the time when she helped her prepare for Nell's wedding. The joy on both sisters' faces was impossible to hide. Stephen also came to celebrate the wedding. Suddenly, she spots Luke getting out of a taxi. She rushes outside. He says he's only here for Nell's wedding, but Shirley knows he's a drug addict, even having escaped from a rehab center. So she gives him some money and tells him to leave. Remembering all this, Shirley can't hide her grief over the loss of her sister. At this moment, an insect crawls out of Nell's mouth, reminding her of a kitten they once buried. Shirley backs away in fright. She holds Nell's body and breaks down in silent sobs. Just as she is about to switch off the lights and leave with her sister's photo, she sees their mother's corpse on the table next to Nell's. Their mother sits up abruptly, just like the deceased kitten from their past, her eyes devoid of pupils, flashing a ferocious smile at her. She's holding the box in which they buried the kitten. The lid of the box bangs shut, and a sharp cat cry echoes in the room. In a hurry, Shirley turns the lights back on, but the corpse of their mother has vanished. The room is as quiet as before, with no signs of anything unusual. Shirley returned home. She glanced at the photo of Nell and then retreated to her room to rest. But she failed to notice that the porch light of the Eternal House model flickered twice. Back at their childhood, one night, Theo, half asleep in her bed, felt someone open the door, lie next to her, and hug her. Thinking Nell was having another nightmare, she comforted her, but those were clearly an adult's hands. When she turned around, she realized there was no one there. The scene shifts to the time when Theo grew up to be a psychologist. One day, she was counseling a little girl named Abigail, who claimed to see Mr. Smiley Face every day. Whenever she heard the creaking sound from the stairs, she knew Mr. Smiley Face was coming and would soon be in her room, grinning broadly at her. Abigail also said that Mr. Smiley Face lived in the basement. Hearing this, Theo encouraged Abigail to protect herself by building mental walls. As we've seen in previous episodes, Theo often wears gloves. This is because her hands can sense something supernatural. Through it, she once found a bottle of fine wine in the trash. Just by touching a bed, she could tell if it had once been a sick bed. Afterward, Theo found a manuscript, Hill House, written by Stephen in a drawer. She recalled 6 years ago when Stephen had wanted to publish this book, a story based on their childhood experiences. He had been willing to give everyone a royalty, but Shirley had rejected the offer on behalf of all, tainted as it was with their mother's blood. With the memory concluded, Theo tossed the book into the trash can. Back to the childhood when Theo was practicing dance in the studio, the doorknob suddenly began to creak. As she approached to open the door, a loud bang echoed. She peered out, only to find no one there. She suspected it was a prank by her brother Luke. Luke was in the kitchen, tinkering with the elevator. The maid rushed over to scold him, as the elevator was dangerous and not a toy for children. Theo felt the maid was being too harsh. As the maid ushered them out of the kitchen, Nell, with her psychic ability, sensed that the maid wasn't angry, but scared. Later that night, Theo woke to forage for food in the refrigerator and found Luke hiding in the food elevator. He wanted to take a ride, and she agreed. She closed the elevator door and pressed the button to go up. But contrary to her command, the elevator descended. No matter how she pressed the buttons to stop it, it was of no use. Her brother ended up in a dark, narrow basement teeming with rats. Fear gripped him as his flashlight began to flicker. He smacked the flashlight while shouting his sister's name. He then saw a corpse-like creature lunging at him. He screamed out in terror. Alarmed by the noise, the parents rushed over. As soon as they arrived, the elevator door miraculously started working again. Luke emerged, insisting there was a monster that had grabbed him below, showing the tears in his clothes as proof. The parents comforted him, while the mother asked Theo to return to her room. After climbing into bed, she cried for a while before falling asleep. Back in the present, Theo, who was sleeping, felt someone tugging at her blanket. She suddenly woke up to find a smiling face at the side of her bed, grinning at her. Theo was still in shock, panting heavily on the bed. At this moment, Shirley happened to come looking for Theo regarding a matter about Nell. Shirley was at a loss on how to explain to her siblings that Nell had taken her own life. Thus, she came to seek Theo's opinion. Theo believed that it was best to tell them directly. Rewinding back to their childhood, Theo walked into Luke's room and found him drawing. He was complaining to his sister that their mother did not believe in the existence of Abigail, the little girl in blue clothes he saw while playing with his dolls earlier. The mother also did not believe in the existence of a basement where lived Mr. Smiley Face, or the monster that appeared that night. Theo touched her brother's hand and assured him that she believed him. She gave him some advice on how to convince their parents. Theo then found a secret passage leading to the basement under a machine. It was a cellar for hiding liquor. On the ground, she found pieces of Luke's clothes, but there was no sign of the monster. That night, Theo told her mother that she had found the basement and gone inside alone. She touched her mother's hand and felt a sense of unease. Looking down, she saw traces of blood on her mother's hand. When she looked up again, she was horrified to see her mother's face covered in blood. Shocked, Theo stepped back, but then her mother appeared normal again. Later, Theo took her father to the basement. A few days later, her mother found Theo and told her that they both possessed some psychic abilities, including Theo's maternal grandmother. They could perceive many things, and like her daughter, she would often feel cold and disliked exposing her skin. Then her mother even gave Theo a pair of gloves in a box, telling her that these gloves could not only resist the cold, but also ward off other things. Back to the scene when Theo visited Abigail's house. She ventured into the basement where Mr. Smiley Face lived. Using her psychic abilities, she lay on the sofa, seemingly sensing the stories that had unfolded on this piece of furniture. She glanced upwards to see a wooden plank overhead, its grain forming the likeness of Mr. Smiley. Exiting the basement, Theo shook hands with Abigail's father, becoming more certain about the nature of the situation. Leaving the house, she sat in her car and called the police. It turned out that Abigail was adopted and had long been abused by her adoptive father. To protect herself subconsciously, she had fabricated the story of Mr. Smiley. Ultimately, the police arrested the father. Afterward, Theo paid a visit to Stephen's house. He handed over to her the profit of publishing his book. However, it was uncertain whether Shirley was aware of this. Before leaving, Theo pointed out several errors in the book. For instance, Stephen had written that Luke discovered the haunted house when it was actually Theo's discovery. She also mentioned that the night of their departure was vividly described, but Stephen had been asleep for most of the time. How could he know all those details? Stephen changed the topic, asking how Theo planned to spend the money. She said she decided to pursue a PhD. On her journey home that night, Theo visited the mortuary at Shirley's funeral home to see the remains of her dead sister Nell. She removed her gloves, placing her hand on the forehead of Nell, using her psychic abilities to feel her sister's pain. Suddenly, Theo saw something that startled her, causing her to scream in a chicken voice. It's revealed that 90 days ago, Luke was in a rehabilitation center, sharing his story with drugs to the others. He simply mentioned that when they were young, their older brother taught him how to recognize faces in the clouds. As he grew older, he lost his way, becoming a drug addict. In turn, an old soldier shared his experiences from the Iraq War, where a young girl tragically died, burned to death. The girl's death haunted him persistently. In an attempt to avoid seeing the girl, he hurt his own eyes with a needle and resorted to drugs. In the rehabilitation center, Luke successfully earned a medal for being drug-free for 90 days. His memory takes him back to his childhood, when he drew a monster he encountered in the basement and showed it to his father. His father said he and their mother had searched the entire basement, but didn't see the monster. The father believed that Luke was just imagining things and didn't believe what he said. Their mother walked in carrying a pile of old items. Nell picked a button, Luke picked a hat, and their mother found a blanket. Through this blanket, their mother was able to sense past occurrences. Back to the present, Luke is chatting with a drug-addicted girl named Joey. He tells her that he retook drugs many times, and because of that, he even missed Nell's wedding ceremony. Later, the supervisor came. Luke was reluctant to part with Joey. At 3:03 in the deep night, he suddenly woke up from bed, holding his neck as if something was choking him. Suddenly, he saw Nell's spirit. She told Luke to run. When he came to his senses, his sister had disappeared. His memory drifted back to his childhood, where he and Nell were playing in the room. Nell threw buttons into a speaking tube connecting the master bedroom and the kitchen. Nell clearly put 3 buttons in, but Luke only received 2. It took a long time for the other button to fall out of the tube. When Luke went upstairs and called his sister through the speaking tube, the tube's surface revealed the image of an old woman with a gaunt face. Startled, Luke called out Nell's name and tumbled out of the bedroom. The next day, Luke found a note under his pillow and learned that Joey had run away in the middle of the night. To find Joey, Luke also ran away. After escaping, he found a public phone to call his sister. He told Nell that he felt very uneasy last night and desperately wanted to know how she was doing. Time rewound back to his childhood. One night, Luke found his sister's bed empty. He opened the bedroom door and saw a ghostly figure with its feet suspended in the air, searching every room along the corridor as if looking for something. Luke crawled under the bed and didn't dare to breathe. The gigantic shadow came to Luke's room, floated to his bedside, and picked up the round hat that Luke had obtained from scavenging earlier that day. Seeing the giant shadow float towards the door, Luke let out a sigh of relief. Unfortunately, his sigh was too loud. The presence seemed to notice and floated back into Luke's room. It lifted the bedsheet and a face wearing a hat appeared right in front of Luke, causing him to let out a piercing scream. The honk of a car shattered Luke's reminiscing. He finally found Joey. Later, he was on the phone with the rehab director, only to learn they'd breached the rules and could no longer stay in the facility. Penniless and on the brink of homelessness, the two had to find somewhere to ward off the cold. Looking up, Luke noticed an elderly man across the street, donning a hat. Recognizing the familiar round hat, he was reminded of the giant presence he'd seen in his childhood. Luke had no choice but to head for his brother Stephen's place. There, he discovered that his brother and sister-in-law were separated. When Luke asked his sister-in-law for a loan, she assumed he wanted money for drugs and refused his request. Left with no other options, he stole a camera and a tablet. As he was leaving, he was caught by Stephen. Guilt-ridden, he traded the stolen goods for money in his brother's hand. Stephen, seemingly unsurprised by this, was witness to Luke's hidden shame as he left. Surprisingly, this scene was a stark echo of a previous one. In his quest to find Joey, Luke had endured many cold shoulders. When he finally caught up with Joey, Joey tricked him and ran off with his money. As Joey was leaving, she kissed Luke on the cheek and made an excuse that she had to go to the restroom, disappearing into the night. Now, the poor Luke was wandering the streets, beaten by local thugs who even stole his shoes and jacket. Suddenly, a memory flashed in his mind, the speech he'd made when he received his 90-day drug-free medallion. Luke shared that he was once a fearful child, hoping he would grow braver. His mother took her own life in a haunted house when he was only 6. Abandoned by their parents, they were forced to live with their aunt. As a young boy, he didn't understand death. He believed his mother would come back one day. He longed for the day she would step out of a car and take him home. But each car, with its flashing red taillights, carried away a bit of his hope. His mother never returned. Due to Joey's betrayal, the despondent Luke drifted aimlessly on the streets. Finally, he called the rehab center. He was freezing and wanted to return, willing to even sleep on the floor. The rehab center agreed. On the frosty streets, Luke silently counted from 1 to 7. This was the method he had told Nell to overcome fear. Suddenly, he felt something and saw his mother wearing a round hat. She wanted Luke to come home. At the critical moment, Stephen arrived and got out of the car. Luke assured his brother that he hadn't taken drugs. He desperately needed his brother's trust. However, Stephen broke the news of Nell's death. Luke was stunned. He didn't believe that his sister would take her own life like their mother. He was convinced that there was another reason behind her death. They were getting closer to revealing the truth. It seems that all the stories pointed to Nell's funeral. In the past, Nell has seen many psychologists. Most just go through the motions, except for one sleep technician named Arthur. He believed in her, explaining that her experiences were normal. He also guided her on how to overcome her struggles. A cheerful background tune played as the story of Nell and Arthur's romance unfolded, leading up to their wedding. One night, Nell, who hadn't experienced sleep paralysis for a long time, suddenly suffered an episode. Fortunately, Arthur was by her side, and she managed to recover. It seemed like the most beautiful love story. At a dance following their wedding, she was dancing and chatting with her brother Stephen when she noticed their gentle-looking mother. The good times for the couple didn't last too long. 8 months later, Nell's sleep paralysis suddenly recurred one night. Arthur hurried to turn on the light, but on the way he suddenly convulsed and fell to the floor. Nell saw her mother standing in front of the window curtains. Trembling, she climbed out of bed and held Arthur's lifeless body in despair. Arthur was dead from an aneurysm, but Nell didn't believe it. She was convinced that her mother had killed Arthur. The memory flashed back to her childhood. The little Nell was playing with a pony and went to the old chest to find a brush, but instead she unexpectedly found a box of tableware. Holding the tableware, she went to find the maid. The star cup inside was beautiful. The maid recognized it as a star cup, which belonged to a previous caretaker of Mrs. Hill, the former mistress of the manor. Mrs. Hill had always wanted the maid's star cup before her death. Nell wanted to drink water from this star cup, but was afraid of breaking it. However, the maid encouraged her to use it, saying cryptically, "Once you become like everyone else, you will no longer see the star cup." At this moment, her mother called Nell over. Looking at the damaged wall, she noticed Nell's name. The mother thought it was written by Nell. She touched the wall and confirmed it was not Nell's writing. She tore off the wallpaper next to it, and shockingly, the words, "Nell, go home," appeared. The scene shifts to one night when Nell was sitting in the car, waiting to take her brother Luke to rehab. But shockingly, Luke asked her to help him buy some illegal substance. Nell obeyed, and after that, she saw Crook Lady again. Returning home, Nell dumped all her medication into the toilet. Her mental state was worsening day by day. Theo paid her a visit. Nell hoped that Theo could use her psychic ability to help her detect if Arthur was still around. However, Theo tried but couldn't sense Arthur's presence. Nell was unable to suppress her turmoil, forcing Theo's hand onto the floor. This angered Theo, who suspected that she was mentally unwell. They ended up having a huge argument, parting on bad terms. Nell was becoming aggressive, and her judgment was growing increasingly unclear. She even crashed Stephen's book launch, accusing him of profiting off their family's stories. This left Stephen quite embarrassed during the event. Later, Nell consulted a psychologist, concealing the fact that she had stopped taking her medication. The psychologist made a mistaken judgment, thinking that she hadn't yet overcome her past. Furthermore, every conversation would inevitably lead to her mentioning Hill House. One night, Nell decided to return to Hill House. She checked into the motel where they had lived after escaping from the Hill Mansion years ago. It's revealed that their father had even left the children there and then disappeared. The siblings shared information among themselves. Stephen, eyes shut, couldn't see anything. Luke recalled their mother hosting a tea party in the Red Room with him and Abigail. The other siblings found this odd because the Red Room was always locked. How could they possibly have entered? The scene then shifts back to Nell in the motel. Waking up in the middle of the night, she finds herself paralyzed, encountering sleep paralysis again. She sees Luke lying on the ceiling. Her memory flashes back to childhood when their father came home, covered in blood. All the other children were asleep, only Nell was awake. At that moment, a police car came to take their father away for questioning. But then, her memory flashes back to the present. Nell had called her two siblings, Stephen and Shirley, but they were too busy to answer. In the voicemail she left for Shirley, she asked about Luke's situation. Suddenly, the hallway lights began to flicker. One by one, they went out. At that moment, Crook Lady descended from above, giving Nell quite a scare. After Crook Lady disappeared, Nell returned to the room. She heard a voicemail from Stephen saying that Luke was safe and sound and had even successfully earned a 90-day sobriety token. After the message, Nell sat on the bed, as if making a resolution. In the evening, Nell drove to Hill House. Sitting in the car, she called her father. Afterwards, the lights of Hill House, which had been uninhabited for many years, lit up. Everything was eerily strange. She entered the house, feeling as if she had returned to her childhood. Her brothers and sisters passed by her, greeting her. However, from another perspective, there was no one around Nell. Shirley then brought Nell to their mother. The mother was also very happy to see her. More words were added to the previous wall message saying, "Welcome back home, Nell." Nell was completely absorbed in it. She chose a dress from her mother's wardrobe for the welcome party. When she changed and descended the stairs, she found that her siblings had all grown up. Everyone was dressed up as if it was her wedding day. Even Luke, who hadn't shown up at her wedding, was there. And behind Luke was her husband, Arthur. Nell was overjoyed and began to dance with her husband. At that moment, Nell felt incredibly happy. But in the gloomy old house, only Nell was dancing. After sharing a passionate kiss with her husband, everyone disappeared. Only Abigail in her blue dress remained on the staircase. The mother was carrying the star cup upstairs and invited Nell to follow. Once upstairs, she handed over the pendant to her. Nell gleefully put it on, because it was something her mother had promised her when she was a child. But then the mother took a few steps back. Nell, coming back to her senses, found herself teetering on the edge of the railing. Her mother left a kiss on her forehead, telling her it's time to wake up before pushing her off. The most brilliant twist in the entire play unfolded. Before her death, she found herself falling endlessly. She saw herself buying drinks in the hotel corridor, frightened by Crook Lady sitting on the ground. As she continued to fall, she saw herself again, on that rainy night, about to take her brother Luke to rehab. Further down, she saw herself immobilized on the night her husband died. And finally, she saw herself as a child, the first time she met Crook Lady. She felt despair. It turned out everything she saw was her dying self. It's her mother who caused her death, and astonishingly, Crook Lady that haunted her was none other than herself, who broke her neck after falling onto the floor. Amidst a downpour, Shirley is preparing Nell's appearance for the funeral. Theo is holding a glass of wine, engaged in a conversation with Shirley. Speaking of Luke, everyone still has a certain distrust towards him. The family gathers finally at Nell's funeral, which is a rare occurrence. Luke and Stephen arrived first. Seeing Nell lying in the coffin, Luke couldn't accept the reality. He ran out of the hall and sat on the sofa. Stephen also struggled to accept Nell's death. He turned around and shockingly found his sister's spirit by his side, moving closer to him. Everyone sat together on the sofa, discussing why Nell decided to return to Hill House, which caused her tragic end. The doorbell rang and Stephen opened the door to find their father, who hadn't had contact with the children for a long time. He seemed quite alienated from everyone. After a few pleasantries, he went to see Nell's body, but in his eyes, she still looked like a 6-year-old. The father felt a bitter taste. He thanked Shirley before finding an excuse to take a walk. He walked down the corridor, suddenly entering a pitch-black room, as if he had come to Hill House. Suddenly, a chandelier crashed down, causing a loud noise. He saw his past self descending the staircase with his wife entering the hall. In a little while, all the children arrived. Together with Stephen, the father moved the fallen chandelier out of the way. The storm is growing fiercer. Suddenly, the sound of shattering glass comes from Shirley's room. Mother is trying to calm the children. Stephen and the father go upstairs to check the situation. Worse still, there's a power outage at home. In the midst of the chaos, Nell accidentally wanders into the room with the statue and sees Crook Lady. Mother quickly takes Nell away and reassures her, saying that she can also see things in this house. Father and Stephen bring flashlights and batteries, and everyone helps to set them up. Theo, who was holding Nell's hand just a moment ago, suddenly realizes she is missing. Everyone starts to search for Nell. Luke is very scared, but Stephen assures him that everything will be okay and he will make sure everyone is safe. The scene shifts back to Nell's funeral. Father remembers how every year Nell would write a letter to Santa Claus. In her letters, she would always ask for gifts for her brothers and sisters, but never for herself. Moreover, Nell would write a letter every month updating her father on the status of her siblings. Stephen can't stand it. He wonders why Father didn't pay more attention to Nell's mental health. He suspects there's something wrong, and that Father likes to withhold information whenever someone in the house is contemplating suicide. Stephen wants answers from his father. Father explains that the neighbor called him after she found Nell beside the spiral staircase in the library after she had called the police. The siblings begin to discuss that their sister had called them on the day she died. That night, only Father received a call from Nell. In the call, she said she had seen Crook Lady. Stephen thinks Nell had a mental illness and blames the father for allowing her to believe in the ghost stories of the haunted house. A heated argument ensues between Stephen and the father. Stephen just wants the truth. Shirley argues with Stephen over the published book, and when Theo tries to mediate, she gets scolded by Shirley. The situation is chaotic, and family arguments escalate. Both Theo and Shirley's husband admit to taking money from Stephen for selling the book. Shirley is shocked and realizes that her husband's private account was used to store the royalty money given by Stephen. It turns out Shirley had been undercharging her clients, running a deficit. Her husband had to use the money given by Stephen to continue running their business. Shirley is overwhelmed with shame, and she drives everyone out of the funeral house. Just then, Shirley noticed 2 buttons placed on Nell's eyes. Abruptly, the power went out. Shirley went to find the backup generator while the rest scattered to help. Only Father remained by Nell's coffin. Just then, Nell's spirit called out to Father from a distance. Following her spirit, he found himself brought into a past stormy night when Mother was searching room by room for Nell. As she left, an old lady appeared on the bed behind her. When Mother opened the door to a room, a boy in a wheelchair rolled out. He passed by Mother and disappeared at the end of the hallway. Father went upstairs with a flashlight, only to find Mother missing. The only thing left was a flashlight. As he searched for her, strangely, he saw her right ahead. However, no matter how loudly he called out to her, she couldn't hear him and finally disappeared at the end of the corridor. Then the window panes began to shatter, but when Father blinked, everything returned to normal, as if nothing had happened at all. Eventually, Father found Mother sitting helplessly on the floor. She claimed to have had a strange dream. Just then, the children in the hall were terrified and began to wail. Mother rushed to check the situation. Some of the kids had seen strange things, heard breathing noises, and spotted a dog. When Father asked where it went, Stephen pointed towards the hallway. When Father went to check and turned back, he surprisingly found Nell. The lights came on at that moment. When Mother asked Nell where she had been, she said she had been right there all along, but no matter how loudly she cried out, no one could see her. The scene transitions back to the present, where the family can't fix the power no matter what they try. Luke is at Nell's corpse, from which he removes a button from her eyes. He asks their father who made it. He has an inkling that Crook Lady is his younger sister, Nell. The father admits that neither Nell nor the mother terminated her own life. But Shirley returns at this moment, saying that only their house is without electricity, while the others aren't. Under the pressure, the father finally reveals the truth. Nell and Mother were killed by the haunted Hill House. Stephen clearly doesn't believe his father's bullshit and starts a heated argument with him. Suddenly, the coffin drops and the lights come on, stopping their argument. It's clear that all these, the power outage, the falling of the coffin, were the doing of Nell. Even in death, she didn't want to see her family fighting. As Shirley is about to fetch her makeup kit to touch up Nell's corpse, she stumbles upon some hormone-smelling scene. Her husband and Theo are in a hot embrace. It's painfully embarrassing for everyone. The father and Stephen leave. Luke takes one last look at Nell before turning away. Nell's spirit is right next to her coffin, but no one can see her. It's like that stormy, powerless night from their childhood. On the day of the memorial for Nell, the father tried his tie in front of a mirror. It seemed as if he were speaking to someone, but no one was there. Dressed, he went to Shirley's house. Before long, her husband returned. She sent him away because she was still upset about his disloyalty. The father intended to offer consolation, but he was curtly told that the funeral was at 10 o'clock. The funeral house hadn't yet opened, and they were not ready to receive anyone. With a shift of scene, the spirit of the mother stood by the father's side. He asked the mother whose temperament Shirley inherited. The mother, comforting him, urged him to have a little patience. The scene shifted back to Hill House after the storm. The father hired men to help tidy the mess in the corridor. Perhaps because of the storm, the walls had become damp and soft. Upon inspection, it was found that water had even seeped into the basement. The father and the workers went to the basement and heard faint scratching noises from the walls. They initially assumed it was rats. A hole was smashed in the wall, and when the father used a camera to photograph the moldy wall, a human figure eerily appeared. The scene shifts back to the present at Nell's funeral. The father felt the relations within the family were a complete mess. Stephen and his wife were also having troubles. It was only then he found out they had been living apart for a long time. Problems had also arisen between Shirley and her sister Theo. Conflicts and arguments spread in this broken family, just like the mold in Hill House. At Nell's funeral, Luke delivered a eulogy. Although he was only born a little before Nell, she was always the one looking after him. The last time they saw each other was 90 days ago, the day she took him to the rehab. His heartfelt eulogy touched many in attendance. The spirit of the mother also sat beside the father, looking proudly at her son. The scene shifted to Hill House, where the father had searched through every room, hunting for the source of the damp and mold. The mother had 4 blueprints of the rooms in her hands, but none of them matched up. To save on expenses, the father decided to clean the mold himself, alongside Stephen. He dismantled the outer wall of the pump room, revealing the moldy inner walls. During this process, the father and Stephen faintly heard a scratching sound from the walls. Just then, the mother brought over the wallpaper. Accepting the blueprint, the father wore a bewildered expression. The hired worker also saw this blueprint and cautiously suggested that the mother should move out for a while. It turns out the man's family from his mother's generation had always been serving in Hill House. Whenever his own mother returned from working in the house, she would show signs of being in a daze. His wife, who was pregnant, worked in this house and eventually gave birth to a stillborn. However, the father was skeptical about the man's story and didn't pay much mind to it. The scene returns to Nell's funeral. Luke crouches in front of her grave, guilt consuming his heart. As he lifts his head, the ghost of Nell shockingly appears in front of him. At this moment, their mother's hand stretches out from the grave, tugging at Luke's arm, pulling him downwards. Stephen rushes to lift him up. Despite Stephen also having seen some strange things recently, he insists to his brother that what they just witnessed was an illusion, a familial inherited disease. The scene flashes back to their childhood. Their father was using a fan to dry the interior walls. The fan seemed to get stuck. Their father asked Stephen to unplug it. The plastic sheet on the wall was blown up, revealing mold that vaguely resembled human figures. In the midst of distraction, the father's hand got a cut from the fan. Stephen tried to explain that he had unplugged it, but the plug was still in the socket. In anger, their father refused to let Stephen participate in his work anymore. One night, their father grabbed a wrench intending to pry open the door to the red house, but no matter how much force he used, it didn't budge. When it came to nighttime, the father woke up, only to find his wife holding a screwdriver pointed at his throat. The father began to pay attention to what the hired worker said. After waking up, the mother looked at the drawing she had painted, unable to recall that she had drawn it. She had been plagued by nightmares and migraines lately. The father decided to follow the worker's advice and have the mother stay at a relative's house for a while. She agreed. Later, the father chipped a hole in the wall and peered inside. To his horror, he found a mummified corpse. Upon inspection, the sheriff confirmed it was Mr. Hill, who had disappeared in 1948. His wife had searched for him fruitlessly. As it turned out, Mr. Hill had bricked himself into the wall. Scratches on the wall suggested he had regretted it. Before leaving, the sheriff asked the father if the house was really haunted, as people said. The father replied that the kids at least seemed to think so. After Nell's funeral, Luke left. Shirley's credit card was gone and Theo's car was missing. The father said he saw Luke looking at the package. Everyone guessed that Luke must have stolen the money again and run away. The father and Theo noticed some black drag marks on the carpet leading into the office. They discovered the Eternal House model knocked over, only to spot the disheveled Nell. But in a blink of an eye, she was gone. When Shirley heard the commotion and arrived, she was livid at what she saw. The father was at a loss for words, just like during the police interrogation in the past. He insisted it was the house that killed his wife. The police asked again about what had happened in the red house. The father said nothing, claiming it had always been locked. However, that night, he saw the door of the red house open for the first time. With the departure of Luke, Shirley reports a lost card to the bank. She even gets the bank to send a message disclosing the location where Luke had swiped his card. Looking at the fragments of the Eternal House model on the floor, she is clueless about why Theo had to destroy it. When Theo tries to explain, an impatient Shirley interrupts her, tactfully changing the subject. To quickly find Luke, Stephen decides to drive to a local drug market. Their father offers to accompany him. While in the car, the father advises his son not to let disagreements with his wife get in the way of their shared life. However, this advice seems to irritate Stephen. He reveals the reason for his irritation to his father. He was worried that his children might inherit the same family disease, so he underwent a vasectomy after graduating from college. His wife, who had been kept in the dark about this, yearned for a child. Once this came to light, it strained their relationship to the point of separation. The story takes us back to their childhood. In the last episode, their father had injured his hand while dealing with mold. Rather than allowing Stephen to continue helping him, he tasked Stephen with taking care of the younger siblings. Stephen noticed an increase in the number of workers around the house. There was even a clockmaker on the stairs, repairing an antique clock that hadn't ticked in 60 years. On a visit to Nell and Luke's room, he found their mother seemingly talking to thin air. Calling out to his mother only led to her looking puzzled, in turn asking where her children were. While playing a game in the room, Stephen discovered a vanity table. Wanting to cheer their mother up, he planned to repaint it and present it to her as a gift. The maid informed him that this vanity belonged to the previous lady of the house, Mrs. Hill, the wife of the dried-up corpse found in the previous episode. His mother was overjoyed to see the vanity, but her expression turned terrifyingly fierce upon seeing the mirror, leading her to shatter it. It was this episode that made Stephen believe their mother suffered from mental illness and that their family's genetics were responsible for their delusions. Later at Halloween, Shirley's husband planned to invite her to celebrate Christmas with their children and wanted to discuss something. However, she didn't feel there was anything worth discussing. She was too drained to deal with kids asking for candies and told him to return to the hotel and rest after the celebration. Once her husband had left, Shirley was alone assembling a model of the Eternal House when she discovered it was filled with mold, just like the old manor. The doorbell kept ringing. Thinking it was children asking for candies, she opened the door to find no one there. On turning around, she saw a man in a suit beckoning to her. After a while, there was another knock on the door. It was Theo, who had come to clarify a misunderstanding from a night when she had drunk too much. Shirley wasn't interested in listening, but Theo, stubborn as always, explained that living with Shirley all these years had, in part, been for her. Shirley was too controlling, and both Theo and Shirley's husband had been working to maintain her image. Just then, there was another knock at the door. Suddenly, the entire room felt as if it had returned to that night at Hill House, filled with relentless knocking sounds. At this time, the bank called to inform Shirley that her younger brother had used his credit card at a petrol station. This station happens to be on the road leading to Hill House, so the two of them decided to drive to that station. The cashier mentioned that her brother had filled up his car with petrol, even buying 5 extra cans of fuel. On returning to the car, their father relayed to Stephen that Luke's life was in danger as he planned to burn down the house. Stephen had always believed their father was responsible for their mother's death, harboring resentment. So he argued that the house wasn't the issue, but his father cut him off. He once thought that by keeping his children in the dark, he could ensure their safety, but reality proved otherwise. The father pointed out that the clockmaker written about in Stephen's book had never been invited to their house. What's more, the father had never built a treehouse for his children. He claimed that they were now descending into the abyss. Out of concern for their safety, he had never told his children what really happened to their mother, nor corrected the errors in their memories. This was to prevent them from returning to the house in search of the truth. As such, he decided to keep his daughters inside the house. But Stephen didn't think they would do as the father said. Just as expected, Shirley and Theo were also driving towards Hill House. They finally quieted down along the way, with Shirley giving Theo a chance to explain herself. As they were talking, they started arguing again. Suddenly, the ghost of Nell appeared in between the driver's seat, scaring the sisters until they lost control of the car and crashed into a field. Theo ran out of the car and began to cry, confessing the truth to Shirley. Her psychic abilities, which disappeared after touching Nell's body, had made her feel like a living dead, unable to sense anything. To make matters worse, the power went out. In the darkness, Theo clung to Shirley's husband. When the lights came back on, Shirley caught sight of them, causing a misunderstanding. Fearing the loss of her sister, she apologized to her. Finally, the two sisters made up. Meanwhile, Luke arrived at Hill House's entrance with cans of gasoline in tow. The house, as if to welcome his arrival, lit up with a scarlet glow. Luke doused the great hall with gasoline and threw his lighter onto the floor. The blue flame spread but disappeared in an instant. He looked up, only to find his mother in a red gown, reaching out to him. Unexpectedly, a ghost appeared behind him, clutching his face. The scene shifts to Hill House in the past. Before the storm, Nell and Luke were sound asleep in their mother's arms. The mother was enjoying her time with the kids. Suddenly, the father took Luke away, leaving a sense of unease in the mother. The day after the stormy night, the mother and the maid were cleaning the shattered glass in the corridor. As the mother entered the study with a cup of tea, her migraine struck again. While she was heading downstairs for some medicine, she passed by the ghost of the clockmaker, saw Luke and Shirley arguing in the kitchen. The cause of the argument was that Luke wanted to give the poor girl Abigail one of Shirley's dresses because she always wore the same blue dress. But Shirley thought Abigail was a figment of Luke's imagination. Seeing her children argue intensified the mother's headache. She told her kids she needed to retreat to the study to rest. A puzzled look washed over Luke's face as he turned to his sister. Mother pushed open the door to the study, only to find herself in the morgue run by Shirley. She grew puzzled. Looking up, she discovered Nell's body lying on the right-hand autopsy table and Luke collapsing onto the floor. Suddenly, Nell grabbed a pair of scissors and cut open her sewn-shut mouth, calling out to her. The shock sent Mother staggering back, falling onto the floor. She returned to the study. In the evening, she recounted this occurrence to Father. She felt that the dream she'd had was incredibly vivid and real. Father comforted her, saying it was only a nightmare. Mother then turned off the lights and went to sleep. During the night, Mother noticed a fleeting shadow from the bedroom. She nudged Father, but he was already fast asleep. Alone, she followed it out, wanting to check what was happening. When she turned back, she noticed Mrs. Hill, the previous lady of the manor, appearing beside the father. Mrs. Hill led Mother to the study, praising how well she decorated it. Mother asked if she was dreaming. Mrs. Hill replied, "We're all dreaming." She then mentioned the room used to be her dressing room, then a nursery. At this point, Mrs. Hill gazed at the bookshelves in front of her, describing the baby cot that once stood there. She lamented, "Nothing is worse than losing a child, but we can't always protect them." It turns out, Mrs. Hill dreamt of her daughter dying from suffocation, of her son crashing into walls in his wheelchair. The ghostly, wheelchair-bound figure that Mother had encountered earlier was Mrs. Hill's son. Mrs. Hill then comforted Mother, insisting it was all a dream. Turning around, Mother saw Luke and Nell sleeping peacefully. Mrs. Hill recognized Mother's love for her children. She told Mother the children were trapped in a horrifying nightmare. At that moment, Father managed to wake Mother up. Mother found herself holding a screwdriver to her husband's throat. She quickly explained that she was having a nightmare. The scene changes to the time when the mother is trying to coax Nell and Luke to sleep. Nell asks her mother, "What do we do if my brother and I are in danger?" The mother assures her that she would always keep them safe. Nell shares her terrifying dream in which their mother tries to kill her and Luke. This sends the mother into a panic. Combined with her own past dreams, she struggles to discern reality from dreams. In Nell's dream, she finds herself lying in bed, her mouth sewn shut. Luke, too, has a dream, one where he's been poisoned and even his blood is toxic. The nightmares of Luke and Nell seem to reflect ominous future events. Suddenly, Stephen appears, finding their mother muttering to herself as she stares into the void. The mother decides she needs a quiet place to think. As she sits down, she spots the maid walking past with a bucket of paint. She confesses to the maid that she initially thought it was the duty of parents to expose their children to the world outside. But now she finds the world too dangerous and wishes her children could stay by her side. Sensing something amiss, the maid urges the mother to leave the house. The mother responds that she plans to stay at her sister's house for a few days. At this point, the dressing table that Stephen gave to Mother was finally ready. Mother was pleased. However, she saw reflections in the mirror of Nell and Luke, who appeared as if they were dead adults. Horrified, she smashed the mirror. Early next morning, she bid farewell to her children, telling them that she was going to stay with her sister for a few days. Before leaving, Luke asked his mother if his friend Abigail could stay at their home. Mother agreed, and then she departed. After Mother left, Father felt overwhelmed. No matter what he did, he couldn't completely remove the mold on the wall. Just then, Mother called Father. We can see that Mother hadn't gone to her sister's place, but rather she was in a motel near Hill House. In the night, Mother secretly took a taxi back to the house. She didn't wake anyone up. She took the rat poison that father had previously bought and brewed a cup of tea in the kitchen. Behind her, the voice of Shirley could be heard. Carrying the tea, Mother went to wake up Nell, Luke, and the girl Abigail. It turned out that Abigail was indeed real. Mother announced she was hosting a tea party for them and led them into the mysterious red room. At that moment, Shirley woke up the father, who was sleeping on the sofa. He rushed into the kitchen and discovered the rat poison had been opened. He had a bad feeling about this. He searched every room, only to find that Nell, Luke, and Abigail were missing. He noticed that the door of the red room was surprisingly open. He dashed inside, only to find Abigail already frothing at the mouth. In a panic, Father knocked over the teacup. During the ensuing altercation, he accidentally pushed Mother against the wall. When Mother regained consciousness, she found Abigail's poisoned corpse on the ground. Meanwhile, the children have already been ushered into the car by their father. Inside the vehicle, Luke spots Abigail, who has been poisoned to death. Now only Stephen remains inside the house. As their father is about to enter Stephen's room, he turns back to find all the ghosts of the house present. He rushes into Stephen's room and wakes him up. This scene is what transpired in the first episode. At this moment, their mother stands outside the door, intending to open it with Mrs. Hill's encouragement. However, she is cautioned by the ghostly old woman who tells her that Mrs. Hill has deceived her. As she wants to learn more, their father dashes down the stairs carrying Stephen. Hearing the commotion, the mother hobbles after them. Through a window, she sees her husband leading the children away. Just then, Mrs. Hill continues whispering in her ear, trying to manipulate her. The distraught mother arrives at the red room to find Abigail's lifeless body on the floor. The sight of the body convinces her that she has taken an innocent life. She looks up, only to find Abigail's spirit, seemingly alive and well, standing at the doorway observing her. At this point, the mother believes she is still dreaming. Mrs. Hill appears again, whispering in her ear, convincing her that all this is but a nightmare. The mother is in agony, wishing to wake from this dream. But under the influence of Mrs. Hill, the mother terminates her life by jumping from the building, with a heavy thud echoing through the haunted house, as though heralding a new companion's arrival. A month ago, this family of 7 was happily looking forward to a peaceful life here, but in such a short span, their world has been shattered. The scene shifts to the rest of the family returning to Hill House for truth. Nell and Shirley are holding the master key, attempting to open the red room, but the door won't budge. Nell says she sees a shadow inside, and on the other side of the door, Shirley is dancing. They see the doorknob turning, followed by a loud knock. It turns out the red room is also Shirley's dance room. Fast forward to the present, Stephen is also drawn into the illusion. He has been reluctant to write the sequel to his book, Hill House, having only managed to write 2 pages in 2 days. But to uncover the truth, Stephen has no choice but to write. His wife encourages him, so their unborn child can learn the story of the previous generation. In Stephen's writings, the story brings us back to the night he entered the house with his father. Stephen saw the man in the hat, but did not dare to look for long. He walked into the reading room with his father, who saw Abigail at the stairway entrance. The man in the hat floated in front of Stephen, who didn't dare to make eye contact and kept looking at his father. After a moment, the man in the hat left. The father and son reached the door of the red room. The father said that the red room would only open when one wishes to open it. Stephen saw Luke lying on the ground and was about to rescue him when the door behind him slammed shut. During his writing, Stephen seems a bit shaken. He doesn't remember anything, not how he returned to California, how he reconciled with his wife, or how she became pregnant. Suddenly, his wife lifts her shirt to reveal dark spots appearing on her stomach, revealing her to be a corpse. Then, Stephen realizes it was Nell who rescued him. Coming to his senses, he discovers that Shirley, Theo, and Luke have all passed out. He rushes to Luke, who is foaming at the mouth and collapses on the ground. Stephen quickly starts performing CPR on him. The story picks up where Luke was attacked by Mrs. Hill, leading him into a fantasy world, and back to the time when his shoes and jacket were stolen, causing him to roam the streets like a homeless man. That night, he pleaded with his caregivers to return to the rehab center, only to encounter Joey, his crushed girl in the rehab center. Joey claimed that she had stolen money and ran away, all in the hopes of affording a hotel room for both her and Luke. Before they returned to the rehab center, Joey tempted Luke to have one last high, revealing a syringe from his pocket. Luke firmly declined. However, Joey's eyes suddenly started to melt, trickling down her face. Awakening from the fantasy, Luke saw Stephen approaching him. The door abruptly closed, and Mrs. Hill launched an attack on Stephen. Meanwhile, Shirley and Theo were looking for Luke and their father. Theo heard their father's voice upstairs and went to investigate. As Shirley turned around, she spotted the same man in a suit who frequently appeared before. He waved at her in greeting. Upstairs, Theo found their father lying on the ground. She called for Shirley only to be attacked by Mrs. Hill. It seemed like they were tackled down one after another. From Shirley's recollections, it turned out that she had met the man in the suit at a cocktail party. He had offered her a drink, and despite indicating that she was married, she reciprocated by ordering a dish no one else ever had for him. They struck up a conversation, and the man invited Shirley to his room. Upon noticing the ring on his finger, she understood that he too was married. Shirley used this as leverage, ensuring that neither of them would disclose their extramarital affair after it happened. Just then, Shirley was astonishingly brought to her own funeral. Lying in the coffin, she suddenly sat up, gouged out her own eyes, and tore at her own face. Luckily, Nell appeared in time, pulling Shirley back from the hallucination. Shirley went to help Stephen, while Theo was still trapped in the illusion. In her hallucination, Theo saw herself with her girlfriend, Trish. Theo recalled her mischief as a child when she threw a stone and shattered a glass window, leading to her mother disciplining her. As she recounted this, she was affectionately engaging with Trish. However, she suddenly became numb to everything, feeling only guilt and fear towards Trish. At that point, countless hands enveloped Theo's body, giving her a thorough massage therapy. Once again, it was Nell who reached out, pulling Theo back to reality. When she woke up, Theo looked at everything with horror. When Luke was pulled into the dream world, he found himself having a tea party with his mother, Nell, and Abigail. His mother told him how much she missed him and even gifted him a gentleman's hat. She invited him to sit down and continue the tea party. However, Nell was resistant to this and urged her brother to leave. Luke sensed that something was wrong. Finally, Nell pulled him back to reality and rescued him from the hell dimension. Nell appeared before everyone, repeating that they had been here before, but no one knew. Nell compared the house to a person, where each room was a different organ, and the red room was the stomach of this haunted house. This red room used to be Theo's dance room, the toy room where Nell found the star cup, the mother's study, Stephen's game room, Shirley's activity room, and Luke's wooden cabin. The room was constantly changing and gradually swallowing people up. Suddenly, Nell told Luke that he must survive. Luke suddenly understood something. Nell reassured him that she would not leave. Theo, Shirley, and Stephen all apologized to Nell, who chose to forgive them all because she loved her siblings. The father woke up, trembling as he took his heart disease medication. The pill bottle fell to the floor. He looked up to see Mrs. Hill, who was trying to manipulate him. Just then, his wife appeared and shooed Mrs. Hill away. The mother asked the father what he'd been doing all along. He said he'd been guarding the door of the house, not letting it open. He was protecting their children, but in doing so, he only made the distance between him and the children greater. Nevertheless, the devil still arrived to haunt their children. The mother blamed the father for taking the children away, causing them to suffer. The father believed that as parents, they should witness their children's lives, no matter what. Despite the father's persuasion, the mother still didn't want to open the door for them to escape the haunted house, because she didn't want to be alone again. Finally, the father, with his arms around his wife, said that if not for their children, he would choose to lie down with her, and they would step into the darkness together. He pleaded with his wife to let him solve the problems. As he kissed her forehead, he murmured that all wandering ends in the encounter with one's beloved. When Luke was on his last breath, the mother opened the door. The father stepped out. They lifted Luke and carried him to the car. The others rushed him to the nearest hospital, while the father and Stephen still had some matters to attend to. In the end, the father revealed the secret he had kept for half his life. It turns out, on that eerie night when they escaped from the haunted house, the father rushed back from the motel, only to discover his wife had passed away. Overwhelmed by grief, he held on to her lifeless body. The butler couple also appeared and found out their daughter Abigail had crawled out the window and guessed she must have gone to the Hill house. Their hearts shattered when they found their daughter's dead body on the ground. Just then, Abigail's spirit appeared in front of her parents and showed them who killed her. The butler couple understood immediately, yet they held no resentment towards the mother because they knew the real culprit was this haunted house. The father initially wanted to burn the house down, but the butler couple, in the hope of seeing their daughter again, persuaded him not to. But they hoped he would seal off the house to prevent others from getting close. In the end, the father chose to stay with his wife in the house. After leaving the Hill house, Stephen reconciled with his wife. Shirley confessed her troubling past to her husband. Theo and her girlfriend Trish rented an apartment together. Luke celebrated his second year of sobriety amidst the blessings of his siblings. Their lives were back on the right track. The pain the house had once inflicted on the family was gradually fading away. Finally, an aged butler husband, carrying his dying wife, stepped into the house so that Abigail could be reunited with her mother. The Hill House stood still in this silent, dark place, unchanged after all these years. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.